Night in the Warsaw ghetto no longer resembled night. It resembled extinction. There were no stars, only the gray breath of smoke, drifting from chimneys that no longer belonged to anyone. The sky itself seemed bruised, swollen with secrets it could not hold anymore. Even the moon avoided shining over that place, as if ashamed to witness its own light fall upon human suffering. In the winter of 1943, Warsaw sounded like breathing ghosts, coughing behind cracked doors, shuffling feet over soot-stained floors, whispered prayers swallowed by cold air before they could reach any heaven. The ghetto was no longer a city, nor a community, it was a waiting room between existence and absence. The streets were narrow not only because of the collapsing buildings, but because fear took up most of the space. Windows were covered not with curtains but with rags, boards, and despair. Even the rats, growing fat from the hunger of others, learned to move in silence. And somewhere in that suffocating labyrinth, a boy lived. No one ever heard him arrive, nor remembered when he first appeared. Some claimed he was born there. Others swore that he walked into the ghetto on a night without footsteps, carrying nothing in his hands and everything in his eyes. His name was Eliyahu Weiss, though most never dared to speak it aloud. By age 13, he had already learned what men twice his age never mastered. A voice is a luxury. Silence is armor. He had a thin frame, almost insubstantial, as if famine had sculpted him from smoke instead of flesh. His hair, once dark, had become dusty with the same ash that coated ruins and bones. But it was his eyes, deep, shadowed, glazed with something unknowable, that marked him as different. He looked not at things but through them. And he never blinked too long, as if afraid the world would change when his lids were closed. He carried a single object. A small tin box, tied shut with twine, dented and blackened by weather and time. No one knew what was inside. No one ever asked twice. Because those who asked once never asked again. He never ran or played in the courtyards like the other children had once done. He did not join the clusters of boys who tried to laugh too loud in the shadows, as if sound alone could push back the darkness. Instead, he stood in doorways at corners, near the edges of crowds, always close enough to see everything, always far enough not to be touched. Sometimes he would stand in the snow long after others had retreated indoors, unmoving, watching the sky as gray flakes fell onto his shoulders and melted slowly into his coat. People passed by him with lowered heads, pretending not to notice, yet they felt something tighten in their chest when they realized he was still there hours later, in the exact same position. It was as if he was listening to something they could not hear. Before the boots, before the walls, before the trains, Warsaw had been a city of voices. Children ran through courtyards with wooden toys and prayer books. Mothers bargained in crowded street markets where spices and bread mixed with laughter. Men argued on corners about theology, trade, and the future, as though the world remained negotiable. On Fridays, lights spilled warmly from windows as families prepared for Shabbat. Candles flickered in polished brass holders, reflected in glass eyes, spoons. The smell of fresh bread, soup, and roasted vegetables floated through stairwells and along streets, clinging to coats and hair. Songs rose from apartments, voices layered over one another like woven cloth. Back then, Eliyahu's world had been filled with sound. His family was well known among their neighbors, not rich but respected. His father, Moshe Weiss, repaired clocks. Not expensive ones, ordinary ones. Kitchen clocks, pocket watches, alarm clocks needing new springs. He believed that every home deserved the sound of time moving correctly, for without rhythm, life became chaos. His workshop smelled of oil, dust, and warm metal. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves crowded with glass-faced clocks, some ticking, some silent, all waiting for his hands. When the sun hit the window just right, the brass and steel gleamed like mute constellations. Eliyahu would sit beside him, small hands tucked beneath the table, watching gears spin and tiny screws glimmer in lamplight. He loved the precise sounds of the work, the faint click of a tool against metal, the springing sigh when a mechanism returned to life, the steady heartbeat of a newly restored clock. "You see, Eliyahu," his father would whisper, picking up a tiny escapement wheel between careful fingers, "time is not what passes, it's what survives." On the wall, a large clock marked the hours in a confident, measured tone. Its pendulum swung back and forth like a rabbi nodding in quiet agreement. That clock stopped the day the Germans arrived. The invasion did not roar into their lives all at once. At first, it was a change in the air, a stiffness in posture, a tightening of law, a new kind of silence following jokes told too loudly in cafes. Then doors were marked, shops were questioned, synagogues watched. Friends began to disappear from familiar corners. Newspapers changed their tone. Radios changed their songs. Finally the boots came. Heavy, polished, rhythmically cruel. They marched over cobblestones that had never known such hatred before, splashing through puddles that once only reflected children's games. Orders were barked in a language that sounded like broken glass and iron. Time no longer ticked. Shattered. Homes were taken, freedoms confiscated, synagogues burned, and their synagogue, where Eliyahu once traced Hebrew letters in candlelight, was turned into a warehouse for stolen belongings, guarded by men who felt no shame touching objects that did not belong to them. Prayer books lay piled in corners, their pages curled and torn, the ink running where rainwater had seeped in through broken roofs. His family was pushed into the ghetto among thousands. Their apartment shrank overnight, not in bricks and mortar but in oxygen, in space, in the number of breaths they felt allowed to take. Hunger became a routine, suffering became ordinary, and hope became an object people hid like money. By winter his father had vanished, either taken, shot, or consumed by the system that erased names faster than it erased bodies. The workshop door hung crooked on its hinges, the clocks inside all stopped at different hours, each one marking the precise moment its owner stopped bothering to wind it. His mother Hannah stopped sleeping, her prayers turned silent, then empty. She moved like a ghost from task to task, folding and unfolding the same piece of cloth, tidying and retidying things that no longer mattered. All that remained of his family's former life was the tin box, given to him on the final night they were whole. Do not open it until you have no other choice. His father had whispered, fingers trembling as he tied the twine. And if that day comes, open it alone. Those were his final words. They echoed inside Eliyahu's mind louder than any shouted order. Unlike others, Eliyahu did not cry where others could hear. He did not ask what happened. He did not beg, plead, or scream. He merely listened, to footsteps, whispers, doors, wind, sobs, walls, and anything the darkness accidentally revealed. The ghetto had its own language if one knew how to hear it. The creak of a stair at midnight could mean someone was being taken. The slam of a distant door at dawn could mean a family had been reduced by one. The hurried shuffle of shoes on the next street might mean someone had found food, or trouble. He became a collector of quiet truths. The ghetto whispered to him things it did not mean to speak. He knew which attic boards creaked and which did not. He knew the exact nights guards switched routes without announcement. He knew which families traded bread for medicine, and which traded secrets for survival. He knew which buildings had walls thick enough to muffle a cry, and which ones carried sound too well to risk raising one's voice. He never wrote anything down. He remembered, as though memory itself was his nourishment. People began to notice. Not all at once, not clearly. It started with coincidences that did not feel like coincidences. A woman once saw him pause at the bottom of her stairwell, eyes tilted as if listening to a sound too faint for others. He stood there for several heartbeats, then turned away without climbing. 2 days later, soldiers stormed her building, dragging a man from the third floor out into the street. Another time, a boy tried to invite Eliyahu to share a crust of bread near a certain wall. Eliyahu's gaze lingered on the corner, on the angle of the street, on the line of sight from a nearby watchtower. Without a word, he simply stepped back into shadow and walked away. That evening, a shot cracked the air near that wall, echoing between buildings like a cruel reminder. Rumors became warnings. Warnings became superstition. Superstition became fear. When Eliyahu avoided a street, something bad happened there. When he stopped near a door, someone inside was taken that same week. When he looked too long at a person, that person became afraid of themselves. No one could say exactly how much was true. Memory twisted under hunger. Fear exaggerated everything it touched. But no one wanted to test where the line between rumor and reality lay. And yet he never harmed anyone. He never even touched anyone. Still, his presence felt like a prophecy no one wanted spoken aloud. People began lowering their voices when he passed. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered ancient blessings under their breath. Children who once laughed at anything unusual now fell quiet when they saw him in a doorway. He was just a boy. But in a world that had lost its balance, a boy who did not break seemed more frightening than a man with a gun. Somewhere beyond the crumbling walls, the Wehrmacht began hearing whispers too, stories carried by deserters, smugglers, and terrified informants. There is a Jew in Warsaw the others fear. He knows things he shouldn't know. He sees what cannot be seen. A lieutenant heard the tale first, half drunk in a back room of a requisition cafe, the words slurred by a collaborator eager for coin. He laughed it off as nonsense, the kind of superstition frightened people invented to endure their own misery. But the story traveled. From the lieutenant to a sergeant. From the sergeant to a captain. From the captain to an SS officer who did not laugh easily. The names spread like infection, from officers drinking after hours, to guards stationed along the wall, to patrolling soldiers whose nerves were already thinning from winter, hunger, and smoke. They laughed at first, a cruel, dismissive, drunken laughter. But no soldier laughed twice. Not after they heard what happened to the two who tried to find him at night. And now, in the frozen breath of February 1943, under a sky too heavy for stars, Eliyahu Weiss stood alone near the center of the ghetto, snowflakes landing softly on his silent shoulders, as if the winter itself feared to touch him with sound, because the most terrifying thing in Warsaw was not a soldier, nor a rifle, nor a uniform, nor a cell, was a silent boy, still alive. The cold in the ghetto seemed alive. Not the natural cold of winter or wind flowing through cracks, but a thinking cold, one that observed before touching, sliding along the skin like invisible fingers searching for weaknesses beneath bone and memory. Eliyahu felt it long before others did. He always sensed things that came before sound. Sometimes the cold pressed against the windows like an unseen face breathing from the outside. Other nights, it seeped from the floorboards, lifting through the wood like vapor from a grave. No one knew how to describe it, but everyone learned not to speak of it. The ghetto learned to fear anything without a name. And Eliyahu had no name that fit him anymore. Children whispered he was not really a child, that he was something left behind after the other children were taken. Adults wondered if trauma had hollowed him, leaving only instincts and silence where personality once lived. A rabbi once muttered that some spirits did not wait for death to become supernatural. But no one ever said any of those things near him. Even superstition feared confirmation. Eliyahu's days were not spent like those around him. Others scavenged, bargained, stole, prayed, slept, froze, or collapsed. Eliyahu walked, but not without purpose. Every step he took felt measured, calculated, listened for, as if the ground itself might betray him. He walked barefoot at times, not out of poverty, but choice. Skin could hear better than shoes. He learned to identify conversations without sound. Vibration patterns in floorboards. Movement density in walls. Dust displacement near door creases. Air rhythm shifts when breath changed. He once stood in a stairwell for nearly 3 full hours, not moving, not breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the air as though reading letters no one else could see. A woman passed him twice, the first time ignoring him, the second time holding her breath, unsure whether he was alive or merely waiting for something that she could not perceive. Eliyahu was not insane. He was attuned, in a way that no human child should be. And just as he listened to the world began listening back. Sometimes walls creaked near him even when no one touched them. Door hinges sighed softly when he passed, not opening, not closing, simply acknowledging. Floors groaned like old men turning in their graves. Metal objects tilted silently as though trying to watch him. Even shadows lengthened unnaturally toward him, rather than away from the nearest light source, as if darkness extended itself in greeting. People pretended not to see these things. Human sanity depends heavily on pretending. The most infamous moment, the one that stopped even the soldiers from dismissing rumors, happened during a night of food ration selection. Rations were never enough, and distribution always included threats. Families lined up before dawn, holding faded ID papers or forged scrap cards. Soldiers stood with rifles, boots planted wide, eyes bored and cruel. Cruelty is easier when boredom assists. Eliyahu was not expected to attend. He never stood in lines. He never competed for food. People assumed he survived through means no one wished to understand. But that morning he appeared. No one saw him approach. He was simply there, standing at the rear of the line, tin box hanging loosely from one hand, eyes half lowered, face unreadable. The line shifted, not physically but atmospherically. A thick silence rippled forward like pressure in the lungs before drowning. An SS guard noticed him. He smirked, bored and annoyed. "Hey, you." He tapped his boot twice in the snow. "Boy, look at me." Eliyahu didn't. The guard stepped closer, planting his rifle but into the snow beside the boy's shoe. "I said look at me." The voice sharpened, but Eliyahu's eyes remained elsewhere, focused on the thin frost forming on a nearby wooden beam. The guard's irritation shifted into something darker, not anger but fragile ego cracking. No one in the ghetto, not even the elders, disobeyed eye contact commands. Yet the boy did not move. The guard scoffed and grabbed the tin box. The entire line inhaled sharply, one collective breath. The guard raised it, shaking it next to his ear. "What's this little rat? Food." Stolen? Contraband? He smirked again, eyebrows curved with theatrical cruelty. Speak. Eliyahu slowly lifted his gaze. Not aggressively. Not pleading. Just looking. A look without emotion, without fear, without urgency, without the human instinct of self-defense. And in that instant the guard froze. Not physically but mentally. It was as if Eliyahu's pupils were tunnels leading not into his mind, but into the void where thoughts died. Something dark, ancient, and unspoken lived behind those eyes, something that did not belong to childhood. The guard's smirk melted, followed by his posture. Breath hitched. For a moment he looked lost, like a man suddenly unsure whether he remembered his own name. He returned the tin box to Eliyahu's palm without another word. Not tossed. Not dropped. Placed. And then the guard stepped back in 2 slow, cautious steps, the way a person retreats from a cliff edge after realizing how close they stand to falling. No one spoke. Not then. Not ever. The superstition became scripture. In the nights that followed, Eliyahu no longer looked like a child allowed to remain alive, but a child permitted to remain alive, as though he existed under exceptional conditions granted by something too intangible to name. He did not sleep normally. Sleep for him was shallow, broken, vigilant, as though unconsciousness was dangerous territory. He slept with one ear uncovered even in the worst cold, and with his hand resting upon the tin box as if it were a heartbeat he had to protect. His mother, though barely lucid anymore, once woke and found him sitting upright, eyes open, breathing slow, body ice cold, as though he had slipped into a different existence where consciousness did not belong to the physical body. Sometimes, in the dead hours between midnight and dawn, he whispered to no one. Not words, breaths shaped into faint rhythms, like coded murmurs from another dimension. Other nights, he placed his ear against walls, listening to memories trapped between bricks, as though architecture itself carried trauma like bone marrow carries DNA. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply observed. When hunger ached, he did not react. When illness spread, he did not weaken. When others froze, he remained warm, not physically but undiminished. It was as if whatever sustained him was not of the body. People formed explanations in private, but no theory ever grew bold enough to become spoken truth. Still, a few whispered possibilities surfaced. He is not surviving, something is sustaining him. He did not lose his father. His father left him with something. That box is not a memory. He hears things no one else can, not from people, from places. Perhaps he did not adapt to the ghetto adapted to him. Yet the most whispered interpretation was the one no one dared to think fully. He became what trauma needed him to become. On one particular night, the sky turned the color of old bruises, and the wind carried the faint scent of singed hair and wet metal. The ghetto streets were silent in a way that felt intentional, like silence was no longer absence, but warning. Eliyahu stood in the middle of a ruined courtyard, snow drifting around him like soft ash. He closed his eyes not in peace, but in calculation. He listened not to what existed, but to what remained. His lips parted slightly. Not enough to form a word. Just enough to release breath with a rhythm that did not belong to human speech. The courtyard air seemed to slow, as though time itself paused to hear what he was trying not to say. Shadows trembled. Somewhere in the darkness, someone whispered. He's not hearing us anymore. He's hearing what the ghetto remembers. At that moment, the truth settled like frost in everyone's lungs. Eliyahu Weiss did not predict events. He heard them. Not voices of living people. Not angels. Not God. He heard the echoes of the future, trapped inside walls that had already seen it. And from that night forward, he was no longer just feared. He was believed. The day the Reich decided to break a ghost. By early March of 1943, the Warsaw ghetto no longer felt like part of a city. Felt like a wound. Pus-colored snow gathered in corners where no one walked anymore. Laundry lines hung between buildings, holding rags that no longer resembled clothes, flapping weakly in a wind that smelled of coal, rot, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood no one remembered shedding. The air itself seemed to have weight, pressing against lungs and thoughts. And through that dense, suffocating atmosphere, a rumor walked faster than hunger. They're coming for him. Not for a smuggler. Not for a known rabbi. Not for a resistance fighter. For a boy. For Eliyahu Weiss. The officer who didn't laugh. His name was Oberst Heinrich Falk. He wore fear the way other men wore medals. Invisible to most eyes, but heavy enough to curve his spine when no one was looking. Before the war he had been an instructor, a man who taught others how to read maps and make orderly decisions. Now he was assigned to oversee security matters in Warsaw, a job that meant signing papers full of names he would never meet. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in logistics. Which is why, when 3 separate reports reached him, each carried by different men, each describing the same boy using the same phrases, he did not dismiss them. The Jews fear him. He knew we were coming before we arrived. He made a guard lose his nerve without a word. Falk did not care about superstition. But he cared deeply about unpredictability. Unpredictable elements broke systems. So when a soldier, pale-faced and sweating, stood before his desk and said, "Sir, I would rather patrol the wall at night alone than look that boy in the eyes again," Falk did not punish him for cowardice. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, fingers interlaced, and said, "Then we will test the boy." It happened on a morning with thin snow and thick silence. The residents of a certain block, long forbidden to gather, now found themselves driven from their cramped rooms by shouting and the pounding of boots. Soldiers moved through stairwells, banging on doors with rifle butts. Rouse. Ola. Sofert. Mothers scrambled for coats that no longer warmed. Children were dragged from makeshift beds, half asleep, eyes wide and unfocused. Old men gripped canes that shook harder than their hands. The air filled with the sounds of rushed breathing, clattering tin cups, shuffling feet, and the constant underlying heartbeat of boots on wood. In the middle of it all, Eliyahu stood motionless in his doorway, tin box in his hand. A soldier reached him and hesitated for half a second, throat tightening, then forced himself to shove the boy forward. "Move," he snapped, voice thinner than he intended. They were herded into the courtyard, a rectangle of broken brick and trampled snow, surrounded on all sides by tall, skeletal buildings. A makeshift platform had been erected near one wall, 2 crates, a plank of wood, and an air of impending verdict. Fox stood there, gloved hands resting lightly on his belt, eyes scanning the crowd with the chill detachment of someone selecting a tool. Beside him, 2 SS officers smoked in silence. The smoke curled around their faces like pale ghosts, briefly hiding their expressions. The people gathered below them like a field of exhausted ghosts, scarves and coats blending into a single trembling mass. "Which one?" Falk asked quietly without looking away. The guard who had once returned the tin box swallowed hard and pointed. "There, Herr Oberst, the boy with the box." Eliyahu felt dozens of eyes slide away from him as the invisible line between him and everyone else became painfully clear. Falk's gaze followed the pointing hand and found him easily. Not because Eliyahu stood out physically, he did not. He was small, underfed, wrapped in a coat too large, hair dull with dust. But Falk recognized something instantly. The boy was the only one not trying to disappear. Everyone else folded in on themselves, shoulders hunched, chins tucked, eyes lowered. The boy stood, still, thin shoulders straight, head level. He did not seek to be seen, but he did not flee from it. That made him dangerous. "Bring him up," Falk said. 2 soldiers pushed through the mass, hands rough, fingers digging into bone. They grabbed Eliyahu's arms and dragged him forward until his feet slipped on the snow and mud. He did not resist. He also did not stumble. His body moved with the dead grace of someone who had stopped arguing with gravity. They hauled him onto the platform, positioning him a step below Falk. The boy's bare toes peeked from damaged shoes, pale and raw against the wooden plank. The crowd avoided looking at him directly, as if eye contact alone might implicate them in something unspoken. Falk studied him in silence. Up close, he expected to see insanity or fanaticism, or some strange fanatic light in the eyes, something he could classify and therefore control. What he saw instead was infinitely worse. Clarity. Not hatred. Not madness. Just clarity. The boy looked at him like one might look at a clock mechanism, observing how each piece turned, how tension stored in one spring eventually snapped another. "Name," Falk said. The wind carried the word out across the courtyard, thin but sharp. Eliyahu said nothing. Falk's jaw tightened. "Name," he repeated. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few mouths silently formed it for him. Eliyahu. Eliyahu Weiss. The boy's lips parted slightly, breath fogging the air between them, but no sound came out. He was not refusing. He simply treated speech as something that could not be given away cheaply. Falk nodded once to a soldier. The rifle but struck Eliyahu in the ribs. It was not a brutal blow. By camp standards it was almost casual. But the sound that followed was hollow, weak, the sound of a too thin frame absorbing sudden force. Eliyahu swayed, diaphragm spasming, but did not fall. He sucked in a sharp breath and let it out slowly, forcing air past pain. Name? Fox said a third time. Eliyahu Weiss, the boy finally whispered. His voice was softer than expected, unremarkable, the voice of a child who should have belonged to schoolyards, not death registers. And what is this? Fox asked, nodding toward the box. Eliyahu's fingers tightened around it unconsciously. A box, he said. Laughter broke from one of the SS officers, a short, barking sound, harsh and humorless. Fox did not laugh. He stepped closer. You frighten my men, he said quietly, so only the boy and those closest could hear. You make them fail to execute simple orders. They say you know things before they happen. They say you see things you should not see. He paused, letting the words thicken in the air. They say, Fox continued, that other Jews fear you more than they fear me. The last sentence was the real crime. Power did not tolerate competition, even the intangible kind. From the crowd, a faint whimper rose and died quickly, crushed beneath the weight of stares. Eliyahu's gaze did not waver. I am just a boy, he said. Fox gave a thin smile. Then you will be tested as one. The test did not resemble any formal process. There were no documents, no witnesses called, no defense permitted. There was only a staged humiliation masquerading as interrogation. A soldier dragged another figure onto the platform, a young man, early 20s, eyes bruised, lips split, wrists bound. His hair was matted with blood and sweat. This one, Fox declared loudly enough for all to hear, was caught trying to smuggle information out of the ghetto. Names of officers. Patrol schedules. Routes. A murmur went through the crowd. They all knew what happened to smugglers of information. Nothing of them ever came back. Not rumors, not bodies, not even their screams. Fox gripped the prisoner's hair and forced his head up. And he says, Fox continued, that he did not work alone. His gaze slid back to Eliyahu. That he had help. The prisoner looked at the boy, eyes pleading, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. He's lying, he whispered hoarsely. Please, I never. Fox silenced him with a dismissive shove. The man staggered, nearly falling from the platform. It is simple, Fox said. We have a traitor in the ghetto, one who passes information to enemies of the Reich. That alone is reason enough to kill you all. But I am curious. He turned to face Eliyahu. My men say you see things. So, tell me, boy. Who else was involved? Eliyahu said nothing. Fox raised his voice. Who else, he repeated, passes secrets through these walls? Which of your kind betrays us from within? The silence that followed was not consensual. It was forced, pressed down by fear like a boot on a throat. Everyone knew the trap. If Eliyahu named anyone, that person would die. If he refused, he would die. If he lied, more would die. There was only one outcome. Death in some direction. Fox's eyes bored into him. I will not ask again. The soldier with the rifle shifted his weight eagerly. Eliyahu's heartbeat echoed in his own ears, but his hands did not tremble. He could feel the crowd behind him, hundreds of breaths, uneven and shallow, like a sea of animals backed against a cliff. He closed his eyes. For a second, the courtyard disappeared. He heard the faint rattle of a loose window pane 3 floors up, the drip of water from a busted pipe near the back wall, the shiver of a man's teeth chattering in the front row, the almost inaudible scratch of a boot on wood as one of the SS shifted impatiently, the tight, controlled breathing of the prisoner beside him, fighting sobs. He opened his eyes again. There is no traitor, he said quietly. Fox's expression hardened. Wrong answer. The rifle but struck his lower back this time harder. The world tilted, sharp pain flaring up his spine. He bit the inside of his cheek, tasting iron, refusing to let a cry escape. He dropped to one knee, palms slamming onto the cold wood to steady himself. Stand, Fox ordered. Eliyahu forced his leg to obey. The crowd remained frozen, as though any movement might imply allegiance. This is your only chance, Fox said. Tell us who speaks to our enemies. Who passes information. Names, boy. Eliyahu's lips parted. For a moment, his resolve fractured. He could end this. He could say a name. Any name. The Reich didn't need truth, only someone to break. But then his gaze swept over the crowd. A mother clutching her child so tightly the child's fingers had turned white. An old man gripping a prayer book with empty pages. A girl whose eyes held no tears left to give. Faces that had already been broken 1,000 times. He thought of his father's hands tying the twine around the box. Time is not what passes, it's what survives. Eliyahu took a breath that felt more like a knife. There is no traitor, he repeated louder this time. No one here helps your enemies. Fox's face remained neutral. That, he said softly, is where you are wrong. He nodded. The two soldiers grabbed Eliyahu and the prisoner at once. They did not shoot them in the courtyard. Death in front of the ghetto would have been too simple, too quick. Instead, they dragged both down a narrow staircase that spiraled into the belly of one of the adjacent buildings, a place that had once been a storage cellar and now existed as an unofficial torture room. The air grew colder with each step. The light weakened, thinning into a stale yellow haze. The smell was a mixture of damp earth, rust, mold, and old fear. The kind of smell that clung to thoughts long after it left clothes. The room they threw them into had no window. Just stone walls, a dirt floor halfway frozen, and a ceiling low enough that taller men had to hunch. The door slammed shut, iron scraping against stone. A bolt slid into place. Eliyahu hit the floor shoulder first, pain radiating through his thin frame. The tin box dug into his ribs. He curled protectively around it. The prisoner beside him groaned, rolling onto his back, gasping. For a while neither spoke. They listened to their own breathing, and to the silence pressing around them like thick mud. Finally the man whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." Eliyahu turned his head toward him. "You shouldn't have refused," the man continued, voice shuddering. "You should have given them someone. Anyone. That's what they want. That's what they always want. A body to hang the story on." He laughed bitterly, the sound collapsing midway. "I am going to die because of something I didn't do," he said. "And you will die because of something you didn't say." He covered his face with his bound hands. Eliyahu sat up slowly, back scraping the cold stone wall. He pulled his knees to his chest and set the tin box between his feet, fingers resting lightly on top. "They won't kill us yet," he said. The man turned his head, eyes wide in the gloom. "How do you know?" Eliyahu tilted his head slightly, listening. Above them, faint but clear, came the sound of footsteps. Not hurried. Not many. Just one man pacing back and forth in even strokes. "Because he is still curious," Eliyahu murmured. Hours blurred. They were hauled out of the cell, questioned, beaten in ways designed to bruise organs, not skin. No blood spilled where others might see it. The violence was methodical, scientific. A series of precise degradations intended to squeeze out whatever information the boy supposedly had. "Who do you talk to at night? What codes do you carry? What is in the box? Who tells you where we go?" Eliyahu never changed his answers. "No one. No code. A box. I listen." His quiet refusal to invent a narrative infuriated them more than lies would have. Once Falk had everyone leave the room. He stood alone with the boy, the single bulb casting harsh shadows on their faces. "You see things, don't you?" he said. Eliyahu's silence was answer enough. Falk stepped closer, hand hovering near the boy's shoulder but not touching it, as if afraid. "You've made my men afraid of shadows," he hissed. "You've turned their own thoughts against them. That cannot be allowed. Do you understand? I will break you just to prove I can." He seized the tin box suddenly, yanking it from Eliyahu's grip. The boy reached for it instinctively. That tiny movement, the first genuine, uncontrolled motion, made Fox smile. "So," he whispered, weighing it in his palm, "this matters." His thumb brushed the twine knot. Eliyahu's breath hitched. "Open it," Falk taunted. "Let's see what your father left behind that makes a child stand against an empire." He began to pull at the knot. "No," Eliyahu said sharply. It was the first time his voice carried real force. For a fraction of a second Falk faltered, not physically but in will. A chill skated down his spine so fast it made him swallow. He closed his fingers around the box instead of opening it. "I will let you keep this," he said slowly, surprising even himself. "For now." He shoved it back into the boy's chest. "But if you make my men tremble one more time, I will open it in front of you." He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "And I will make you watch as whatever hope is inside dies." By the end of the third day they had made up their minds. No confession had been extracted. No network exposed. No codes revealed. But in a system built on narrative control, evidence was unnecessary. Fox signed a slip of paper with two names. Eliyahu Weiss, unknown male, approximate 22. Beside each name a single word. Urshiason. Shot. The execution would be private in the yard behind the building. No crowd this time. No spectacle. Just the quiet administrative removal of two problems. When the guards came for them again, the prisoner began to sob openly, the last of his composure gone. I don't want to die here, he choked out. Not like this. Not in their yard, like an animal. Eliyahu watched him, eyes strangely calm. Everyone dies somewhere, the boy said. They don't decide what we were. Only where we fall. It should have sounded wise. It only sounded tired. The guards marched them up the stairs, boots echoing sharply against stone. Each step felt like the tick of a clock reaching the top of its cycle. Outside, the air bit their faces like knives. Gray sky. Gray walls. Gray snow turned to slush underfoot. A firing squad of 4 soldiers stood ready, rifles loaded, eyes grim. None of them looked eager. None of them looked away either. They were trapped in the mechanism as much as anyone. Falk watched from a distance, inspecting his glove as if the scene bored him. When the 2 prisoners were positioned against the wall, the world narrowed. The prisoner to Eliyahu's right shook uncontrollably. I'm sorry, he whispered. I don't even know what I'm apologizing for, but I'm sorry. For everything. Eliyahu did not tell him it was all right. He did not say it wasn't his fault. He simply turned his head slightly and said, Remember something good. Right now. Anything. The man squeezed his eyes shut. For a second, the tight grief in his features softened, just a fraction. Bread, he whispered. Warm bread, in my mother's kitchen. Hold that, Eliyahu said. The command was oddly firm for such a soft voice. Falk lifted his hand lazily. Ready, he called. The rifles rose, metal glinting dully. Aim. 4 barrels leveled at 2 chests. Eliyahu felt everything at once. The tremor in the nearest soldier's hands. The itch of wool at the back of his own neck. The cold seeping through his shoes. The roughness of the wall against his spine. The weight of the tin box under his coat, pressing into his ribs like a second heart. Fewer. The word hung in the air. The world held its breath. Nothing happened. No shots. No recoil. No thunder. Silence flooded the yard so suddenly that the wind itself seemed to stop. One of the soldiers blinked, confused. He squeezed the trigger again. Nothing. Another soldier glanced down at his rifle, panic flickering across his face. He pulled the bolt, checked the chamber. Loaded. He tried again. Still nothing. It was as if the guns had silently agreed to refuse. A strange, unnatural stillness descended, a breathless space where logic failed. The men looked at each other, then at Falk, then at the prisoners, their fear turning inward. For a heartbeat it was unclear who was being judged. Falk's jaw clenched. Again, he snarled. Now. They obeyed, frantic fingers jerking at triggers. Click, click, click. Not one bullet fired. Not one. The yard had become a stage where reality temporarily stepped aside to make room for something else. Slowly, every head turned toward Eliyahu. He was smiling. Not with joy, not with triumph, with something much worse. Recognition. As if he had heard this moment whispered into the walls days before. As if the ghetto itself had refused to let its most feared child die on command. Somewhere deep inside the building, a clock that had not worked in months ticked. What? Loud enough to be heard in the yard. Falk felt the sound travel up his spine like an accusation. His eyes met Eliyahu's. And for the first time, the officer who did not believe in ghosts started to wonder what exactly the Reich had tried to kill. The basement did not have walls, it had teeth. That was the first thought that formed in Eliyahu's mind as he regained consciousness, lying sideways on a dirt and stone floor so cold it felt like bone. The air was thick and sour, saturated with moisture and the metallic aftertaste of old rust and old fear. Every breath felt as if it scraped his throat. Somewhere above, water dripped rhythmically, like fingers tapping wood to remind him that time still existed, even here. But time, as his father had once whispered, was not what passed. Time was what survived. He opened his eyes. The darkness was not full, it had gradients, layers, textures. Some parts of the cellar were dense black, others faintly gray, illuminated by pale ribbons of light seeping through cracked floorboards overhead. Dust floated like tiny comet trails each time a boot thudded above them. It was impossible to tell how long he had been here, hours or days. He moved slowly, every muscle screaming. Somewhere in the same cellar, a rat was chewing something soft, making wet tearing sounds. The smell confirmed it was not food. The boy inhaled slowly and forced his senses to awaken one by one. Sight. Shapes in the dark. Sound. Drips. Soft nibbling. Faraway boots. Touch. Cold stone. Pain layered like peeling wallpaper across his ribs and back. Smell. Mold, iron, and something hopeless. This. Blood. Not fresh anymore, dry, acidic. No one else was in the room. At least not alive. He sat up, bones trembling like wood bending under snow. His fingers moved instinctively to his coat pocket. Empty, except for the twine string his father once tied around the tin box. The box itself had been taken. That bothered him less than the why. The SS never cared about sentimental object. Which meant someone did. He closed his eyes, letting memory become architecture. He rebuilt the last hours in silence, using only what he could rely on. Sensory logic. The screams, the courtyard, the blows, the final order. Then the march. Down, not up. Not to transport. Not to execution field. To isolation. Which meant not elimination, at least not immediately. Which meant observation or experimentation. Which meant Falk was not done. His father once told him while teaching him to repair a broken wall socket. Power is rarely loud. Loud is distraction. Power is patient. So the boy waited in silence, heartbeat slowing like a calculated clock. And when the cellar door finally creaked, not slammed, not burst, but creaked, Eliyahu understood something vital. They were afraid of what they might wake. Boots descended slowly down the wooden steps. Not SS boots. Lighter. Softer. Too careful. Not someone used to cellars, someone avoiding noise. A lantern flickered into view, revealing a tall, thin man wearing a long dark overcoat instead of a uniform. His hair was silver at the temples, not from age but from too many thoughts that had nowhere to escape. Dr. Klaus Brenner. A military-appointed psychological researcher. One of those scientists of the mind drafted to understand compliance, resistance, and predictive behavioral patterns under wartime conditions. His files were rumored to have footnotes written in pencil because even he did not trust ink. He stared at the boy long before speaking. Eliyahu Weiss, he said, voice quiet but sharp. Stand if you can. The boy stood. Slowly. Quietly. Without wince. Brenner's eyelids lowered half a degree. Fascination, not pity. You understand why you're here, he murmured. Eliyahu said nothing. Brenner continued. There are reports. Unreliable, most likely. Exaggerations found in populations under extreme distress. Still, he stepped closer, lantern illuminating more than his face. It illuminated intent. You are an anomaly. Eliyahu blinked once. Slow, feline, calculated. That frightens them, Brenner whispered. The boy sensed it. Brenner was not like the others. He was not interested in punishment, nor superiority, nor indoctrination. He was interested in prediction. Which meant the most dangerous man here was not Falk, but the one who sought understanding instead of dominance. Tell me, Brenner said, setting the lantern down. How did you know they would come for that family? The Kaplans. The night before the raid you moved them. Someone saw you. Why? Eliyahu inhaled slowly. He did not answer. Silence, used correctly, was more revealing than truth. Brenner studied him with the patience of a man who disassembled clocks to understand seconds. You're not afraid of me, he whispered. The boy looked directly at him, not defiantly, not submissively. Analytically. That was answer enough. Brenner removed a folded notebook and pencil from his coat. He wrote without breaking eye contact. Subject. Displays absence of anticipatory fear response. Pupil reactions normal. Posture. Grounded, aligned with center mass instead of reflexive defense curve. Possible sensory hyperawareness. He paused. Sit, he commanded. The boy remained standing. Not to disobey, but because he had not agreed. Brenner's lips twitched, almost a smile. Very well. He paced slowly. When someone survives an abnormal number of near-death encounters, there are 3 possibilities, he began calmly like a lecturer. 1. Coincidence. 2. Hidden information. 3. Adaptive neurological evolution triggered by prolonged trauma exposure. He leaned forward, voice dropping. Which one are you? Eliyahu finally spoke, voice like frost forming on glass. Which one do you need me to be? That answer, that counter-question, froze Brenner's spine. Unpredictability. Not chaos. Not madness. Calculus. Which meant the boy understood the game. Brenner whispered, You're not the one they should fear because of what you do. You're the one they should fear because of what you observe. Eliyahu did not blink for a full 7 seconds. Then he said quietly, You're asking the wrong question. Brenner's breath caught. The wrong question. Meaning there was another question, one that unlocked the pattern. Brenner removed a pocket watch, silver, polished, flawless. He held it between them, letting the lantern light reflect off the metal. What time is it? He asked. The boy did not look at the watch. He looked at Brenner. Then he spoke. "You didn't wind it this morning?" Brenner froze. The watch had stopped 2 hours earlier. He hadn't noticed. His voice cracked for the first time. "How did you know?" The boy lowered his head slightly, not as submission but precision, choosing the correct tone, not the correct answer. "You're a man who requires order to remain stable. You tap your finger twice every time your routine is interrupted. You did it 5 times when you entered. That means your morning rhythm changed. Which means you didn't have time to wind it." Silence. Then pencil on paper, frantic. Brenner whispered almost reverently. "You're not seeing the future. You're seeing what people don't know they reveal." The boy blinked once. And that was confirmation. "What do you want, Eliyahu?" Brenner finally asked. The boy inhaled. Not deeply, accurately. "To decide," he whispered. "Decide what?" "Which person I become." Brenner's throat tightened. For the first time he realized Eliyahu was not a subject, he was a variable. And variables are only dangerous when they choose. Before Brenner could speak again, footsteps thundered above, urgent, multiple, not rhythmic enough to be patrol shift. Someone opened the cellar door, shouting down. "Herr Doctor. Oberst Falk demands your presence, immediately." Brenner grabbed his notebook, eyes locked on the boy. "This discussion isn't finished." Eliyahu replied. "No. This test isn't finished." The lantern went out. He did not blow it. He simply knew when the flame would fail. Brenner emerged into Falk's office 30 seconds later, not because he was ordered to, but because he wanted to analyze context before confrontation. Falk was standing, hands at his sides, jaw fists clenched. The posture of someone who received information that did not fit the world he believed in. On the desk. The tin box. But inside, not valuables, not a weapon, not bread, not forbidden writing. Just pages. Small fragments of paper, layered, numbered, sorted by charcoal markings. Patterns. Timelines. Cross-reference behavioral predictions. Observation matrices. Dates of raids, guessed and correct. Guard mood variations charted. Ration schedules, plotted. Risk zones annotated. And at the bottom, names. Not of betrayers. Not of survivors. Of those most likely to break. Brenner whispered, almost afraid. It wasn't prophecy. Falk's voice was dry as scorched wood. It was analysis. Brenner exhaled a silent realization. The boy is not dangerous because of what he knows. Falk closed the lid slowly. He is dangerous because he might be right. Falk did not fear the supernatural. He feared statistics. Numbers did not scream. Numbers did not hallucinate. Numbers did not lie. And the boy's numbers matched his own, even raids Falk had not yet announced. Brenner turned to him. "We cannot execute him now," the doctor whispered. "If we do, we risk destroying the only mind capable of mapping probability under extreme deprivation." Falk's jaw moved once. "That is not my concern." "It should be," Brenner replied softly. "Because this war will not be won merely with firepower, but with prediction." Falk didn't answer. Because in that moment, for the first time since the war began, he did not know which side truth belonged to. That night, as soldiers argued 2 floors above and 2 men in uniforms debated the value of fear versus logic, Eliyahu sat alone in the cellar. Not waiting, not breaking, not praying. He was calculating. When the final drip of water fell, he opened his eyes and whispered into the darkness. "They still don't know the real question." The ghetto did not sleep during the nights that followed, but it also did not wake. It existed in a state between breath and memory, suspended like frost that refused to melt even when touched by the sun. A strange tension spread through the blocks. Not hope, not fear, expectation. Rumors had begun to move faster than the cold, weaving themselves into whispers that clung beneath doors and curled between blankets. Mothers told children to stay quiet, elderly men prayed silently without closing their eyes, and even those who had already surrendered to despair felt an intrusive, unfamiliar sensation. Something was about to break. Not violently. Not loudly. But perfectly. Meanwhile, beneath 3 floors of stone, wood, ash, and quiet hatred, Eliyahu sat against the cellar wall, his breathing controlled as if he inhaled through numbers and exhaled through strategy. He did not cry. He did not pray. He did not wait. He observed. The first observation, they had underestimated stillness. Stillness was not passivity. Stillness was collection. Every sound in the building had become a signal. The cadence of boots, the pattern of guard rotations, the lazy rhythm of unlocking mechanisms, the voices that argued but never agreed. He knew that humans did not fail because they were weak, but because they assumed others were. And the one thing Nazis never considered was that a starving child in a sealed room could be the most informed person in the building. On the fourth night, someone descended into the cellar. Not Brenner. Not Falk. Not a guard. The steps were uneven, hesitant, and faster than caution allowed. Someone nervous. The lantern's orange glow revealed a girl no older than 15. Her hair was cut jagged with a knife, her hands wrapped in bandage strips once used as winter cloth. Her eyes were not frightened, they were empty, like someone who ran out of emotions and decided not to order more. She whispered, breath shaking. They told me, you're the one who knows how to leave. She did not say escape. She said leave. The distinction mattered. He looked at her, and she shuddered as if she'd been seen too accurately. What is your name? He asked. Rivka, she replied, swallowing hard. We're still locked upstairs. They said the deportation trucks are coming in the morning. I heard 2 officers talking. He nodded once. She waited for instructions, but instead he asked, how did you get here? Her answer determined whether she was useful, dangerous, or broken. I followed the cracks, she whispered. That was enough. Not physically, psychologically. She had recognized structural weakness, not doors. He stood without effort as if his bones knew no weight. Take me to where you entered. Rivka led him up the cellar stairs, past the warped door that never sealed properly, through a narrow hallway where the walls seemed to sweat cold air, and finally into a pantry that no longer contained food, only jars filled with mold, dust, and the faint smell of something once sweet. She crouched and pushed aside a crate. Behind it, a gap. Not big enough for an adult. Barely sufficient for someone thin as hunger. But size was not the true advantage, perception was. He did not crawl immediately. He placed his palm against the floor. He waited. Drips from the cellar ceiling hit stone with perfect rhythm. Boots above marched with predictable cycles. But beyond the wall he felt it. Airflow. Not large, not fresh, but directional. He whispered, this is not a tunnel. This is a transfer of pressure. There must be a second cavity. Rivka looked at him, bewildered. How would you know that? His answer was not prideful. It was fact. Cells are never built solid. Fear requires sound. Sound requires voids. They crawled through the gap and dropped into a narrow chamber between buildings. A forgotten utility zone once meant for pipes and wiring, abandoned when war made maintenance irrelevant. Darkness smelled of metal split by cold. Rivka trembled. How do we get the others? Eliyahu did not blink. You already have. She blinked, confused, until she heard it. Shuffling. Breathing. Soft weeping. They had followed her. Children, 2 elderly men, 3 women, and a boy who could not have been older than 8. Even in hopelessness, humans follow motion. Every eye looked to Eliyahu. He was not their leader, he was their last data point. He scanned faces, calculating optimized allocation. Who could crawl fastest, who could carry, who could silence, who could remember instructions accurately under stress. He formed groups mentally. Behind him, the smallest boy whispered, will we die tonight? Eliyahu answered, no. Death is predictable. Tonight is not. It was not reassurance. It was strategy. Before moving, Eliyahu did something no one expected. He told everyone to sleep. They resisted, terrified, confused, desperate. But he insisted, voice controlled. You do not flee with fear. You flee with oxygen, clarity, and stored reaction time. He lay down first. Slowly, reluctantly, everyone else did. It was not a sleep of peace, but a sleep of preparation. Hours later, before dawn, he woke them with a whisper. Now, move. Not because morning was safest, but because morning guard rotations rely on routine, not alertness. Fearful minds struggle. Exhausted minds collapse. But rested minds comply with intelligent sequence. One by one they crawled deeper. The path grew tighter, darker. Many almost gave up. One nearly screamed. Eliyahu placed his hand over her mouth, not harshly but with control, and whispered, you are not trapped. You are passing through somewhere others cannot follow. Those words were not comfort. They were reframing. And reframing is the greatest survival weapon of all. The cavity eventually widened into a forgotten coal chute behind a German supply depot, barricaded from outside, not inside. Meaning, no one imagined escape in reverse. As they reached the exit grate, they heard distant German voices discussing fuel, winter readiness, and impatience. No alarm, no urgency, no awareness. Eliyahu gestured for silence, studied the great bolts, then the wall, then the hinges, then the sound pattern. He whispered, we don't open it. We wait for weakness. Minutes later, as if the world itself obeyed logic, a truck reversed into the depot, shaking the wall. The vibration loosened rusted screws by exactly half a rotation. He placed fingers where metal met stone, and pushed. Not strong. Not loud. Just correct. The grate slipped free. One by one, 39 prisoners passed through. No dogs barked. No guards noticed. No alarms sounded. They disappeared into the white embrace of pre-dawn snow. By sunrise, Falk received chaotic reports. No forced entry. No cut bars. No footprints. No tools used. No bodies. No leads. He demanded proof of direction, but soldiers found something unexplainable. Footprints that suddenly stopped, mid-pattern. No turning back. No continuation. As if dozens of people ceased existing between steps. A medic whispered, "This is not human." Falk answered, "It is worse. It is undetected." Weeks later, rumors spread across Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, and even Berlin. A nameless Jewish ghost, too silent for execution, too precise for fate, too unpredictable for military classification. Some called him Der Flusterjunge, the whisper boy der Unsichtbar, the invisible one der Mitternachtsschatten, midnight shadow der Judas Schackmeister, the Jewish chess master. But among the prisoners who survived and those who disappeared with him, he was never called supernatural. He was called Hazaker, the one who remembers. No record ever confirmed Eliyahu's death. No official statement marked him as escaped. No grave ever claimed his body. But decades later, when old soldiers in forgotten bars argued about impossible wartime anomalies, someone always mentioned a case file kept permanently sealed. Case number 47 BRN, the Warsaw predictive subject. And if anyone asked why it remained classified, the oldest veterans answered with pale faces. Because you cannot kill what always knows 4 moves ahead. And somewhere, in the ruins of a country that once drowned in commands and numbers, children still swear that on silent winter nights, when decisions must be made, they hear a voice that says, "Do not choose by fear. Choose by outcome."